to TMF TV. I'm your host, Oscar Van Heerden, and I'm joined today by Somadoda Fikeni from UNISA. We have Lindiwe Makhunga from Wits University, and of course we also have Ms. Zama Ndlovu from Liberty Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
Perhaps we are here today to just reflect on the 2016 local government elections that was just held in South Africa, and perhaps just talk about the various outcomes and the fact that for many political parties, in fact for all of them I might add, it seems they are in uncharted waters, because out of all the councils we have no less than 27 hung councils to date. And as we know, many of the political parties are beginning to talk to each other, are negotiating, are horse trading and so on. Just generally what came out of this period, we saw a significant drop in the support of the governing party, the ANC, a marginal increase by the Democratic Alliance of about 2%, and then of course the first entrant, the Economic Freedom Fighters, also making their bid in the local government election to the tune of about 8.19%. Exciting times. Let's start by talking about just the messaging and the run-up to the 2016 election. Your impressions about that?
Well, I would simply say that the campaign itself was quite intense, and the messaging on the part of the ruling party didn't show any freshness. You had a sense that you had seen some of the messages before. The manifesto lacked any kind of innovation, and it was not inspiring. And during the initial period of its campaign, I would say ANC was drawn into so many other things. One being the defense of its leader, who was limping from one challenge to the other, whether legal or the attack on the business associates and so forth. And ANC also was contradicting itself on the issue of the SABC, the challenges around the candidates which it was putting forward. In other places you had candidates being killed in what seemed to be infighting. And in other major metros you had a rejection of some of the candidates who were presented. Whereas DA was very clear in its message, one, mainly targeting the metros. So it was a very strategic intervention to say we had seen the ANC dramatic drop in 2014 national and provincial elections in the metros, so they targeted those with the anti-corruption message, the need for change, and interestingly, even at times taking over the liberation heritage and icons such as Mandela to project themselves. Equally so, EFF, or the Economic Freedom Fighters, they provided some freshness. They seemed to capture the youth in the main and those disaffected persons, and their branding and the brand projection was quite stronger in many ways compared to the other, parties. So to me, I do think that the promise of delivering for the poor, the promise of almost, generous promise, ambitious promise, which was not easily realizable. But overall, I think national issues dominated, because it was the images of national leaders, it was the message of what the party can do nationally, and very little of the local issues that dominated.
No, absolutely. I mean, that brings me to my actual next question, which is that it seems that this particular local government election took on a very national election flavor. I mean, your thoughts about that, Zama?
I think from the side of the national or the parties, the national issues were dominating. I think the parties were going for kind of simple narratives, either change, corruption, or we've done well, or I for one am not quite sure still what the EFF message was,
Mm-hmm.
really, other than kind of we are dealing with corruption in government and let's do more for you. But it was not a very clear message from a local level what the EFF was selling. And I was part of a lot of discussions in different places across the country with young people, and you would see kind of this schism between what young people were asking, which were local government issues, and the kind of response you were getting from the public officials, which would be kind of one-liner about this very specific question and in general, trust us, or we've been doing this for a long time, or we can do it better than them.
Mm-hmm.
It in many ways, the lack of focus on local issues was the fault of the parties themselves.
Yeah.
You didn't get a sense from any of the political parties that they were really trying to engage with the experience of being a citizen and answering the questions of what's gone wrong and how are you going to do it better. Those two questions were not really being answered by any of the responses.
Yeah.
And the manifestos were not engageable. I mean, they were not written. They were very technocratic, often just not in response to
A bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, there was no conversation that was happening between citizens
Mm-hmm.
and the political parties. The political parties were really talking to each other.
Lindiwe, your take on it? Do you think political parties read the mood? Dr. Fikeni spoke about this, reading the national mood. Do you think that they did that well, or did they miss a step or two?
I think that they definitely misread it. As Fikeni said, I don't think that there was an acknowledgement of the fact that there needed to be a new approach. Because you had an entirely new demographic of voters as well. You had a newly kind of enfranchised 18 to 35 year population of people. You have a huge youth demographic that were just more radicalized this time around, and they just needed something a little bit more concrete than the mudslinging that was going on.
Yes.
But I also honestly do believe that I don't think we can talk about local government in isolation from national government. And I do believe that these elections were interesting because it's taken South African voters almost 22 years to make the connection between corruption and the lack of service delivery. And of course, for the people who study politics, it's very obvious. But the average citizen doesn't really kind of understand the mechanisms of where money is allocated and how it's allocated.
Mm-hmm.
But hearing about Nkandla and the corruption within national government and just not being able to access certain services on the ground level is, I think, what definitely had the biggest influence on this election. Because 5 years ago, I mean, corruption was still at a high. I just don't think that citizens had really made that connection between the lack of services at local level and the fact that people were being investigated for tender fraud.
Mm-hmm.
And that connection has definitely been made.
Yeah.
And citizens they're protecting what they perceive to be the resources that are due to them now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, talking about that, Dr. Fikeni, just your comment on what do you think the economic factors do you think that had any significance? Did it play a part in terms of people's making up their mind?
I think it was quite fundamental in many ways, because if you remember the 2008 financial crisis globally, because we had a World Cup in South Africa, it was delayed by 2 years or 3 years before we could feel the full, impact of that. Now with unemployment, with poverty levels, with the perception that these are also linked to corruption, with the young black middle class aspiring to be something and trapped in our education system, the fees must fall, roads must fall, insourcing must fall. And what was happening in the political sphere, the Nkandla matter became iconic in a sense. That in itself, I think, drove many people to the edge. And besides that, on average, most of your post-liberation movements do hold on the narrative of saying we liberated you for almost 20 to 25 years. After that, it started not making much sense, especially to the younger generation, which is feeling the majority of problems, whether it's unemployment, violent crime, HIV, AIDS, education crisis. So those are the people that begin to respond in a way to this. Never mind that even in the unions, there were crises that people were beginning to experience, fragmenting what used to be a very united tripartite alliance of the ANC.
Absolutely.
So those crises in the labor front as well, combined with the hopelessness experienced by the youth. However, in the rural areas, where now I bring the social dimension to this, they experience the ruling party differently, generally. Most dependent on social grants, having seen electrification, water provision and so forth, receiving the message that should you remove the ruling party, you may lose some of those, or other parties are not very strong in promising on those. I suspect that is the reason why you had the ruling party still holding on, though with some marginal declines in the rural areas. But in the urban areas, you have your working class paying tax, paying for services, cost of living going up. You have your middle class and your business class paying tax, looking for the returns, which they do not seem to see, except for many meager vanity projects that you see in the municipalities, some of which have failed.
So in a way what you're saying is that the general lack of leadership from the tripartite alliance also contributed to people actually going to the polls and voting in the manner that they did. Confusion with the unions, but also no direction from the South African Communist Party.
Actually, it's not a matter of no direction as such. ANC for the first time went into these elections without its traditional support muscles. COSATU was busy self-mutilating. SACP had disappeared in action and early in the year had started attacking the ANC over state capture, over pending purging of the cabinet and so forth.
Sure.
The Youth League was so weak that most of the youth had been taken over by the EFF, and the Women's League was so weak on the gender issues because they felt that they had to defend the president. So for the first time, ANC goes into these elections without those critical muscles. It's like an 8-cylinder car moving into a race now with just one cylinder.
Actually working. And let's just talk about the metros itself. I mean, obviously that's where the theatre played out. All the attention was on the big metros. Nelson Mandela Metro, clear. The DA has made significant inroads. What does that say to the people of the Eastern Cape and of course the people in and around the Nelson Mandela Metro? Zama?
Well, I think we expected this one. Of all the metros, this was the one metro that, if you are a betting person, this is
the icon of the anti-apartheid struggle, the first to go.
It was clear. The writing was on the wall. The ANC tried to react to that and sent in its troops, and still
Too little, too late.
It was far too little, and it was not in response to the issues that people had. And this is the ANC's problem, is that it kind of has been kind of an inwardly focused beast, this huge system that's so inwardly focused that citizens have all felt like they're on the outside, and these elections were suddenly that one big moment for citizens to say, actually, we're still here, and it's time to pay attention. But for Nelson Mandela Bay, very, very clear that this was going to happen. if you look also at the numbers, and I'm very bad at remembering numbers, if one looks at the local level national numbers, pretty much happened across the board, right?
Yeah.
So even in 2014, this city of Johannesburg, city of Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, was written in the way that people were voting if you dug into the local level numbers. And the ANC should have responded then, but again, it was the ANC spent kind of kicked into gear quite late, spent a long time defending the president, spent a long time trying to respond to service delivery protests by kind of intervening at the SABC and then pretending it's not intervening.
Yes, and do you think that race politics played a role, Lindiwe? I mean, minorities feeling marginalized, perhaps not even feeling that they have a home within the governing party any longer?
Definitely. I mean, we see the fact that this particular election specifically has been defined by South Africans not voting historically, and also not voting along racial lines. And unfortunately, that has been the ANC's approach. So it was a tired approach. And it could no longer justify it with the current levels of service delivery and corruption. I also think they underestimated the intelligence of voters, truthfully. And talking about Nelson Mandela Bay, it was quite interesting at kind of this last push towards getting support. Towards the coming onto the election, and the fact that all of a sudden taps were appearing and toilets were appearing and government parcels were appearing. And if I was a voter, I would have thought to myself, so if you can do it this fast, why hasn't it been done for the past 5 years? That would anger me considerably. And also insult my intelligence, because you think I do not see the connection between my vote and you're continuing to have access to these resources.
Yeah, I mean, Somadoda, the administrative arm of government is in Tshwane, and it's going in the opposition direction. I mean, it must be quite a psychological blow to the governing party. And as we know, Johannesburg as a metro, historically in the last 5 years, one would argue very vocal in terms of the national leadership and some of the choices they've made, and yet they too struggling towards the end of the race. Your take on that?
Actually, I do think that the biggest psychological blow is to know that Gauteng in its entirety has been brought below 50%, that is the ANC, which means the place where almost 40% of the country's GDP is generated is lost. And now that in the psychology of the ruling party to say you are left with the rural periphery is quite devastating. The argument that was used in the Western Cape that you have a different demography there of whites and coloureds making the majority is gone. So that in itself, I think, the head of government being the union building. Now you'll have, in all likelihood, a DA mayor there. Whenever heads of states are coming in, they have to be welcomed by the opposition mayor. And that in itself could be something for the ANC. I think it has sent, tremors. If I may, I just wanted to add something to Nelson Mandela Bay.
Sure.
Yeah. The first one, typical, in the Western Cape, ANC allowed infighting without intervening between Skwacha, Rasul and so forth for years until it collapsed. In PE, the same thing. Those in the municipality, the mayors and the leadership of the ANC went head to head. In the space of 3 years, they had 3 mayors. And one of those, when you thought they would intervene, they brought a very elderly, person, ineffective Ben Fischer. But besides that, the fact that NUMSA, who's based in the auto industry, primarily in the Nelson Mandela Bay, was pushed out of COSATU, became another factor because it used to be a very strong organizing machine for the ANC. So those are some of the dynamics. Even when Danny Jordan, with all his administrative acumen, came in, the political side was still fractionalized, it was still very weak and not very supportive. So the medicine came, but by then the patient was dead.
I'm sure you've listened to Bantu Olumisa and his input around cooperation with regards to all the smaller opposition parties. Do you think a different scenario perhaps that could play out, or is it pie in the sky?
I don't think it is a pie in the sky, because coalition making is a practical reality now. We've seen the opposition in parliament trying to tackle President Zuma and the ANC. They came together. And in this particular case, they have a short window period, a week and a half, to make coalitions work. If they read the mood to be saying people wanted change from what they were seeing in the ANC, they're likely to come together in many of the municipalities. But I've also heard him have a nuanced approach of saying UDM would support a party which had garnered the most votes in any area, because that's the will of the people.
Yes.
Which means he was opening up to say, elsewhere I could work with the ANC if it is a Guruleni, where it came close to 50. But elsewhere I'll work with the DA in Tshwane or Nelson Mandela Bay and so forth. And he also was calling for this national convention to say problems are so big, let's meet and talk as a nation. So those are some of the messages that I think have been quite consistent when he's been calling for economic codessa in the previous elections and so forth.
Yes. I mean, just talking about that, you know, I was thinking about the fact that in the case of multi-party democracy, and of course it's being encouraged and so on, do you think the ANC is listening? What do you think is the messaging that the ANC is taking from this 2016 local government elections?
I think the ANC is realizing that people want a government, not a liberation movement. They're looking for political parties that are responsive to their situation. I sat on a panel with the mayoral candidates for the city of Johannesburg, and the question of cooperation came up. And this was a youth conversation, and people were saying, okay, now you're in competition, but somebody's going to come out as an outright winner. Are you guys willing to work with each other in the service of citizens? And the way that the candidates approached that question was very worrying to the youth crowd, in that there's this feeling that you guys don't seem to get what we're saying here, which is we're looking for people who are competing to be of service and to be a government. And I think this was, especially with City of Tshwane, but just in general, going down from 62 to 54, is making the ANC realize that people are voting for governments. They are no longer kind of paying back their dues to a liberator.
Dr. Fikeni? Well, I do think that people have seen the contradiction between the promises of a liberation movement and the values it ought to adhere to, which were quite different from the manner people conducted themselves. Corruption, inequality growing, people fighting over tenders, and basically people have stopped joining the ANC, they are joining individual factional leaders. Power has been personalized. That, to me, is the cancer that has been eating into the ANC. ANC could no longer perform in its optimal capacity because people were working according to the slate, which faction you belong to, no matter whether you were capable or not. And also the packaging of the message, where you always regurgitate an old message of liberation. I said in another platform, to young people pressed on all sides by problems, you tell them that you were in Robben Island. In their mind, they asked, did you take a morning or afternoon boat because they see a tourist attraction. You say, I was in Zambia, they say, oh, did you go to the Vic Falls? Because to them, the point is they want material conditions changed rather than this, repackaging of liberation when people are actually beginning to act in a crude form of a mercenary behavior to say, because I went to Robben Island, because I went to exile, I have to be ahead of line for tenders, ahead of line, as if now it was an outsourced, commissioned service of a mercenary.
Sure. I mean, and I guess the question on everyone's minds are indeed, to what extent will the outcome of this local government election influence the 2019 general election? And of course, as you also know, between now and then, we also have to contend with the much awaited National Conference of the African National Congress in 2017. Do you think that we can expect similar trends and patterns in 2019?
If you do not have ANC that introspect honestly and robustly and find a team of leaders who can change the course, if you have an ANC that will begin the blame game tearing itself apart, if you have an ANC that will obsess and fixate itself with defending its leader, you're almost certain that the situation will be worse. Because remember, ANC reached its peak in 2004 when it almost touched the ceiling of 70%. Since then, the trend, you can put it on a graph, has been a downward spiral. The only difference is that it was down by 3%, down by 2%, until 2014, when in the metros it seemed to be a free fall. Now, if that trend continues, remember, as we speak now, ANC has a majority of less than 4% nationally. All it needs to be is the same trend to continue. Same people disaffected by the ANC deciding not to participate, then ANC is out of government in essence. So ANC is this giant, if I were to use the metaphor of Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was too strong in the 80s as a heavyweight champion. No one could beat him. It was Mike Tyson who worked very actively to destroy himself. ANC in many instances has been pressing a self-destruction button, and it will have to stop doing that. And these suicidal tendencies will surely be an indictment for the ANC after 106 years at that moment of an organization that has survived colonial forces, survived apartheid government, and now it couldn't survive the internal insurrection.
Absolutely, Zama.
I think it depends on the character of the people who are in it and the balance of internal forces in terms of do we have more people who are really in this to make a buck, or do we have more people who are in this who've been sitting back and saying we're waiting for a moment and this is the moment. I tweeted something like, what I'm afraid of is that Pravin is going to get fired and then they'll get the key to Treasury and in 2 years, And I mean, it seems very extreme, a point of view to take, but there are multiple paths here. There's the path of quickest way into getting as much as possible if the character of the majority of people who are in power within are here for that. Or there is this moment of saying, actually, this is enough. The thing is, the ANC does not have a good record of kind of clawing back a lost position. When they lost the Western Cape, they at first there was a coalition government, and then they just kept losing more and more.
They just started imploding.
Yeah. But also we don't have that much data. This is the first time that we're going to have enough places to actually start seeing whether or not what's going to happen in Gauteng, where the ANC's Gauteng branch has really been the best, actually, you know.
But there's another narrative that we should look at, because ANC is a dominant, sometimes it used to be near hegemonic political force. How opposition parties behave once in power in these municipalities. If they get into coalitions that are fragmented, that collapse all the time, it could then drive them down. There is nothing which says opposition trajectory will always be steady and linear. If where DA has taken over, suddenly some white folks start throwing their weight to say, yeah, it's our time, they start getting more properties, more land and so forth, and the majority start seeing that this is a reversal of the gains, of the last 22 years. You'll see a reaction like no other place, which will be worse than the Western Cape. Because DA has been effective in talking effective service delivery, good governance, anti-corruption, but it has not been effective on the narrative of transformation, which I think the majority of people are yearning for that. You may have clean streets, you may have accurate bill, but if you still are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, at some point, that is not sustainable.
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, the mere notion that the opposition parties are weak, I think a different message is what came out in this local government elections. And indeed, the ball will have to now be in their court. If they want to play in the big league, so to speak, then they need to up the game. Because it's the very same electorate in Johannesburg and surrounds that has decided to punish the governing party, but they're certainly not going to take things for granted once a coalition party or coalition is in charge of the municipality. So I take that point. I mean, I think Kgalema Motlanthe, former President Kgalema Motlanthe's view that we are on autopilot. Your take on that?
Well, I wish it was autopilot, because autopilot suggests that pilots knew when to press autopilot button and they go to sleep because the plane is cruising. In this case, the pilots are fighting in the cockpit. That's the problem. Because there is no computer mode which says we'll land here at this moment, you'll warn us when things are going wrong. ANC is in an internal fighting, very intense. It will get worse before it gets better. One scenario, President Zuma, who is hating that he was forced to drop Van Rooyen, where he appointed and disappointed Van Rooyen over the weekend. Therefore, he may just be angry and want to purge SACP and other people within the cabinet. And the reaction might just be worse.
Yes.
And also, those who are for the president may work so hard that they forget that there is 54 million people, 26 million voters, that they become so absorbed. I think my colleague here said ANC is this beast that is inward looking. That they may be so obsessed with the internal fighting that you can't be talking of any pilot or a sailor in that particular situation.
Absolutely.
You're just afraid that the plane may crash or the windows may be broken.
Just as we zoom into some form of conclusion, talking about the leadership of President Zuma, do you think that opposition parties are a little bit too obsessed with the incumbent, with the fact that the president needs to vacate the high office? Will that solve our problems?
No, I don't think it's going to solve our problems, but I think it's an effective marketing gimmick. It's
an effective starting point.
Yeah, it's a very effective way of being on the front pages of our newspapers almost once a week, right? Every time the National Assembly do something more and more dramatic, and you'll be on the front page. So it's quite a good gimmick for that. And in fact, if I were if I were in the EFF, if I was making decisions in the EFF, I would not push hard enough to have the president leave. Because then what are we going to talk about? Because then we're going to end up having to be in opposition again.
Sure.
So it's an effective obsession to have, because one, it makes the ANC defend itself, and it distracts the ANC from the introspection that we've been talking about. It actually keeps it going. No, we're not going to dance to the tune of the opposition, and then it keeps digging itself into this problem. So as a strategy to actually be top of mind and disproportionately represented in the media, it's a great strategy for the opposition.
I mean, so one can understand. You come out of the 2014 general election, got 62% of the electorate. It's a big mandate. I perhaps have smolanyana skeletons, as some might call it, but that's a powerful mandate. Why would I want to vacate national office? Is there some realism in that argument from Zuma's point of view?
Remember that the 62% comes because ANC had become a stronger brand than the leader. So it was carrying the leader along.
Yeah.
He had become a liability. And in the urban areas at that moment, you have a drop of anything between 9 and 7%. At that moment, the flickering lights which said things are not going well should have come out. And not only that, ANC's own base is not coming out to vote, it's not energized. Whenever the president is addressing the crowd, people go into the malls, they are busy doing other things. They come when the entertainment groups start singing. At that moment, you begin to say, looks like there is a problem. Instead of dealing with that, the winning faction within the NEC of the ANC start pushing the president forward to be the face of the elections. When they had an opportunity to use local faces, local candidates and so forth. So in this particular case, I do think that, again, the drop in the local government elections, it's the same electorate that will be voting in 2019.
Sure.
Is so dramatic from 62 to 54, or just below 54, having come from 65. So the sliding slope is quite clear where it is going. Should you just keep the same average, you are out of power 2019. So that is why I do think that the fact that the leader has been limping from one crisis to the other has actually been a big problem for the ANC.
Sure.
But also it has tested ANC's leadership, in a sense, because, as my colleague was saying, the detraction from talking about its mandate, its achievements, instead protecting the president. But for the opposition, there is also a catch though. EFF almost split at its beginning because other people were not expelled by the ANC, like Adlem Kachama. We're saying we thought there was a leftist project here. We come in, we see obsession with Zuma, obsession with the ANC leaders who expelled us, to a point where politics of ideology are sometimes replaced by the politics of personal bitterness and betrayal.
Yes.
So that in itself, I think, opposition would have to be very careful on how they package this, because their wish that Zuma goes may just be fulfilled and you may have a new fresh leadership that may actually reposition the ANC.
Absolutely. I mean, and finally, just to talk about, not that we are necessarily fortune tellers, but what do you think will be the next steps? As we speak, the ANC is convening a national executive committee over 4 days. That in itself should speak volumes. Do you think that we are going to see anything remotely on the lines of self-correction, or is it going to be more of the same?
At this moment, the balance of forces within the NEC suggests that you will see more of the same. more so because the leader himself, over so many years, has not shown himself to be a person who takes, some introspection to say, what if I'm contributing to some of these challenges? On the Nkandla matter, he maintained that he was correct until court said you were wrong.
Yes.
On the SABC matter, he's just quiet and just relating with the people. On the Guptas, whether they were lending and so forth. So he retreats, but he's quite resilient and he's quite, stubborn in a sense of saying, I'll stay my ground. On Van Rooyen, the whole of the ANC, the country says this was a mistake. He has remained and said this was the best choice. He doesn't even realize that the person who is the most qualified, according to him, ought to be shining in the new portfolio of local government. You ought to be saying we missed something here. That doesn't sway him from that. Similar on the state capture. NEC says we have a problem of state capture. He says which state capture? So this whole notion of a person who works through the collective and so forth, it's a facade that is beginning to actually peel off, as you see that it's a leader who stubbornly sticks to his position no matter what, and it's a leader who believes that he's being persecuted and is not very amenable, is not very much sensitive to the public opinion and respond to it, So that in itself is the one that will create biggest problem for the ANC going to the ANC leadership conference, because that usually is the time when negativity is generated, when tension is generated, so it will get worse. Only after December next year we will tell whether ANC has managed to start a process of self-correction. But at that moment, it will be left with a year and a half to perform.
And it might be very late.
It might be very late.
Zama, your last final thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think the president loves the ANC. Because I think if you love the ANC, you will do what's best for the ANC. And we've seen many leaders do what was best for the ANC because of their love for it. And I'd rather be an ordinary member and keep the integrity of the party than stay here and prove myself right. And I don't think he's the only one who is no longer in love with the ANC. I think we're going to see exactly how much love there is left for it with the NEC's meeting. But I doubt that we're going to see that kind of self-sacrifice and that kind of, I'm going to take an unpopular position here because it is for the love of this organization and I want it to retain its integrity. So I'm not hopeful about change. I think we're watching kind of this huge boulder just rolling down the hill, and there's not much. It's gained so much momentum. This downward spiral that it's likely that it needs a crash. It needs to stop somewhere where it's crashed, and it has to reform, and maybe it will become an opposition party for a while, and then maybe if it's lucky it will. But it will have to reform and rethink, but this version of itself is imploding.
And I mean, just to also finally talk about these 27 hung municipalities. I mean, at the moment, people are horse trading, as I said at the beginning. Do you think that clearly the EFF is the kingmaker? They apparently are trying to take a posture that there are no such. And that they will assess matters on its merits individually. We hear in the corridors that they've insisted to speak to the national leadership of the ANC because they are needed in more than just the metros in Gauteng. Do you think we are going to have maturity on that front to try and get out of the hung municipality label? Or are we bound to have minority governments within the local government sector?
Well, I do think that the 2-3 scenarios. You may have coalitions, but I doubt they will work very well, whether the EFF has gone DA way or ANC way. The wounds are too deep and raw and too personal between the EFF and the ANC. You hear this in the tone of its leader and some of its leaders. They are scarred. Equally so, those who are for the president, they just can't resist even thinking of a possibility that you could be dealing with the Malema and so forth, because that becomes a psychological victory for them. On the other side, DA and EFF, ideologically and philosophically, worlds apart.
Yeah.
Take the Rustenburg, municipality, wherein EFF encouraged people to occupy houses, and in a ward which it has won, court from the municipality has said those people should vacate, and EFF says we're standing with those people who occupied those. So you may have such instances playing out in different places, and again it creates challenges. Of course, it's a different dimension in northern parts of KZN. IFP and DA, I think, will work fairly well, but IFP and ANC may have challenges here and there, more so because IFP would believe that ANC conspired with NFP to split it apart.
No, absolutely. I'm sure there's all sorts of controversial theories flying around and introspection being done. I mean, I think just as a conclusionary note, I think what is important, and I'm sure you will agree with me, that first and foremost, the day itself went off fairly smoothly. The ISC declaring it free and fair. The majority, in fact all parties, accepting the results of the elections. A good day in South Africa for multi-party democracy. Clearly, it's becoming an acceptable phenomenon, which can only be good. And with that, coalition politics. And I think that in itself is quite a vibrancy that going into the future. And then, of course, the most important point, I think, for me, is the fact that the voter has realized the power of his or her vote in order to make a choice. And that has spoken volumes in this particular 2016 elections. I want to say thank you very much for your insights and views. I'm sure all of you have received it as food for thought. From my side, Oscar Van Heerden, the panelist, thank you for joining us on TM.